and disable admission control because they think they're doing themselves a service. Wait a minute, I don't want to be told I can't turn on resources. That's why I bought the hardware for. Well, if you do that, you're probably going to create a problem downstream as you start adding more virtual machines. Turn on HA. When you turn on HA, the bottom admission control policy becomes important. This is arguably some of the worst named settings I think I've ever seen in my entire history of IT. Host failures that the cluster tolerates. Interestingly enough, a difference between version 4 and version 5 is that the word "the" is now available, which I think improves what this means a little bit better. Host failures the cluster tolerates essentially means out of all of the hosts that comprise that cluster, how many hosts can fail that the cluster can protect against. Right? Typically this is set to 1. If you have a very large cluster, you might put it at 2. But when you would set this to 2 is when you think that the possibility that 2 hosts would fail simultaneously and you want to protect yourself against that. That's when you might set this to 2. Remember, this cluster can tolerate the failure of no hosts. Right? There's nowhere for it to go. This cluster, conversely, can tolerate the failure of 1 host. I'm going to set aside 1 host's contribution of resources so that I can tolerate the failure of 1 host. That's what host failures the cluster tolerates means. Now, this is a good thing to do because if you turn this to 1, you're automatically protected against any host. Be careful though, because that also means the largest host. So if you have dissimilar sizes among your cluster hosts, you're going to set aside the resources assigned to the largest host because you have to protect against its failure. Now, not all of us have necessarily the requirement that we protect all of our VMs. We don't have to protect every VM. Maybe we just protect some of them. Now, in a 3-host cluster, right, I am protecting 1 host, or I could set myself to 33% of CPU and memory resources that I'm protecting. Okay, these two are now equivalent. I'm protecting against 1 host's failure. Or I could get a little more sly with things, and instead of setting this to 33, maybe set this down to 20. So instead of trying to protect the entirety of 1 host's contribution, I'm actually going to set this to 20%, which is a little bit less, and that allows me to, well, to identify. I want to protect some virtual machines, but not all of them. I'm going to set this to 20% for now because I want to show you something here in just a minute. If I set those to 20%, I have to be careful about these other settings here, specifically the VM restart policy. So when I set this to lower than 1 host's contribution, I then am going to have to go to each virtual machine and identify which ones should get restarted on the surviving cluster member when the failure occurs. Now this sets the default policy, and I usually set this to low. So by default, every VM will restart with the same priority, which is low. And I can go then and set medium and high on my really important VMs so I know that they're going to fail over first. I also have to be conscious here of if any of the hosts should somehow get isolated from the other hosts, their management network gets isolated. Now in vSphere version 5, this is a little bit less of a problem because I have a secondary backup channel called a heartbeat data store, a heartbeat network, that protects myself against a host isolation response. When I have a host that's isolated, the VMs are sort of stuck on that isolated hosts. It used to be the suggestion was to shut down those VMs. Now, because of the heartbeat data stores, generally we leave them powered on. Host isolation response is you have either experienced an isolation event and hate it, or you've never experienced it. It's a really painful day. Over here, I can choose, okay, I'm not concerned about the virtual machine so much as the stuff inside the virtual machine. Okay, the VM monitoring restarts individual VMs if their VMware tools heartbeats are not received within a set time. I have to be careful with this, because if I turn this on and for some reason I disable the VMware tools service, well, I'm going to restart the server.